Hello, everybody. I'm rather inept at formalities and rituals and ceremonies. So, my phrasing is not always felicitous when it comes to formal occasions. I generally say hi to everybody, and then everybody gets very offended because apparently keynote speakers and inaugural speakers are supposed to look and sound very profound. I don't. So this is like anticipatory bail. Okay. If you think people in this position should speak in a certain way and have certain mannerisms, I'll fail you. I don't do that. My thanks for the invitation here. I am, as Divya and Dr. Brinda, the head of English, know, not very easy to persuade when it comes to traveling. I'm a very lazy traveler. So I know that the Department of English here has been trying very hard for the last 3 years at least to bring me over to this very historic college, to this very eminent institution about which we all recognize even in our parts of the world. So my thanks primarily to the formidable persuasive powers of the Department of English faculty, the principal, Dr. Brinda, for an interesting conversation about the challenges of administration and academics in the morning today. To the student volunteers, Dinakaran and others, Saeed and others, for doing much of the legwork to get this thing going. The artist for that interesting and challenging memento. And above all, to the institution for thinking up a topic like this, because pages and planets are in many ways interlinked. How they are interlinked is the crux of the matter, because as you will see from what I'm going to say, the purpose of science is usually to explain the world as it is. They break it up into little molecules, they tell you chemical reactions, the physics of it, the materials part of it. But there's only one discipline that tells you about the world as it ought to be, and that's literature. That's the big difference. Literature is not satisfied with explaining the world as it is. It's interested in trying to find out how the world could be, the possibilities and the possible worlds that we could at some point envision, craft, and come to occupy. My job here is a very small one, and my focus is even smaller. I am interested in the poetry from the global south, which talks about the planet. Most people in this room, especially those who willingly or unwillingly study English literature, unwillingly because sometimes you don't get your seat in political science, and then move here by default. I'm sure you've seen school annual day programs, right? So the children don't want to come on the stage, so they'll be standing in the corner, and then somebody shoves them and they come and they stand frozen. Several people in literature are like that. They didn't want to be there. Somebody shoved them, and then there they are. And then they don't know what to do. They look around like small children on the stage in annual day programs. That's probably because we don't quite know whether literature has a social and functional value. It's because of the way we practice it. It's because of the way we think about it. But it does, as I hope to show. So my talk is Postcolonial Eco-Poetics and reading for the planet. Not reading the planet, but reading for the planet. I'll begin with a couple of lines from two poets. This is Udguru Nunakal, who's an Australian Aboriginal poet, in her poem The Unhappy Race, where she says, "You alone have left nature and made civilized laws. You have enslaved yourselves as you enslaved the horse and other wild things." That's Nunakal. My next is a Native American poet called Simon Ortiz, who writes in his poem, starting at the bottom, "When Jack Pyle opened up on Laguna land," Lagunas are, of course, Native Americans, "some Laguna men got on all right at the bottom. The Acoma men, Acoma being another tribe, went to the lake mines and always got stuck by the space on the application forms for previous mining experience. When they are looking for a job, they're supposed to fill up an application form, and they are asked to fill up a column which asks for previous mining experience. And the irony, as Simon Ortiz points out, is that Native Americans have never mined or extracted materials from the earth. That's the job of the modern day white man. And that's the irony that is being pointed out here, that the Native Americans will not get a job because they have no previous mining experience. They have never mined. They have thought of the earth as sacred. You don't dig through the earth. You don't plug the earth with holes and drilled machinery. Ortiz and Nunakal write these lines in the midst of rapid and radical developments in global thinking for and about the planet. And I would think the idea of climate change originates in the 1990s. Many of you were hardly born at that point in time, I understand. 1990 saw the publication of the first assessment report, FAR, from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. In 1991, the First Nation People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit was held, which formulated and published the 17 Principles of Environmental Justice. The first Earth Summit was held in 1992, during which the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was first established. So the appearance of climate change, climate crises, and adjunct terms in public discourse and the cultural imagination may be dated to those years. The concept sustainable development, of course, will come up much later at the United Nations World Conference on Environment and Development in 1995. SDGs will be crafted only in 2015. Finally, in a not unrelated field, in 1990, we get the most sustained definition of the word and concept care. What does care mean? Two feminist sociologists and political scientists, Berenice Fisher and John Tronto, defined the term which we still use. Quote, caring can be viewed as a species activity that includes everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex, life-sustaining web. 1990. Fisher and Tronto's wide-ranging definition took into account the living and the non-living, the human and the non-human, and made the case for a certain approach towards the planet. And when integrated into literary studies, this approach towards the planet will emerge as what I'm calling eco-poetics. Eco-poetics is the literary enunciation of the themes and forms that are drawn from and drive the public discourses of anthropogenic climate change, from environmental degradation to care for the planet. I should also, before I get into the nitty-gritty of my paper, speak about how I am defining the Global South. The term Global South refers to places and peoples displaced, dispossessed, and dominated through racialized modes of conquest, oppression, and control, principally by European settlers and governance systems, and are marked even today by uneven development during and after colonialism. South, within quotes, is a geopolitical materiality and a metaphor. Metaphors of belonging and non-belonging, displacement and habitation serve the purpose of alerting us to histories of events, conditions, and factors. Speaking of causal factors, Potawatomi philosopher Kylie White has argued that anthropogenic climate change is, quote, an intensification of environmental change imposed on indigenous people by colonialism. And it's an important argument. What she's arguing is that what we think of as environmental change is one more version of race-informed or racially dominated colonialism, which means to say environmental degradation, displacement, and migration are part of histories of colonialism, and new and old forms of inequities persist well after colonial rule has officially ended. I'll have reasons to come back to this when I make the point that you cannot speak of environmental justice without speaking of social justice. They are inseparable. So the twin domains of environmental and social justice or injustices have to be addressed together. I also use the term eco-poetics to include both geopoetics and geoaesthetics. Geopoetics is earth-making, literally meaning making around the earth, and geoaesthetics is the mutual imbrication of geography and aesthetics. I know it sounds very fancy, but actually it's not. When you actually look at the poetry, you see it in operation. So don't get put off by the terminology. I've often been accused by people, and no doubt they've been eaten by bears, as happened to the people who mocked the prophet, that I use too much terminology. Eco-poetics has been at the center of poetry and poetry criticism for several decades now. And the big question is, and since that's the conference title, page to planet is very easy to say. What should be the format of the page, but? Is the nature of the page important because nature is important? As in, what would be the appropriate genre in literature in which we can speak about climate crisis? What form should the warnings, the cautions of climate disaster take? For those of you who watch films, you know that the apocalyptic model, 2012, The Day the Earth Stood Still, The Day After Tomorrow, The Book of Eli, that is the standard model. The world will end, and of course Americans will save the world. Nobody wants to save the Americans, apparently, but Americans want to save the world. And the apocalyptic model is the most popular one in ecological writings and film, even today, right from the very beginning. One suspects that's because unless you shock people into addressing and looking at climate change isn't visible. It's an incremental process. It takes place over millennia. We don't think about it, but please note the fact that all of us have individual memories, but so does the planet. There is planetary memory. The petroleum oils that we use are the result of 450 million years of fossilization. 450 million years ago, the trees collapsed. They were sedimented into the soil. They broke down, decomposed, and became oil. So, when you extract oil from several layers of the earth, what you are digging up is actually planetary memory. We don't think about it that way. We think, oh, how can a planet have memory? Planets do have memories. They take the form of pages we don't know how to read. They leave trails all over us. Fossils, for example, sedimented layers in the earth are all examples of planetary memory. That is also the book of nature, not the one that silly old fellow Wordsworth wrote about. People after listening to my lectures on the English romantics usually say I put them off the romantics forever, which is perhaps true because I focus a lot on the politics of Wordsworth and not the nice things he says about rainbows and Lucies and pretty nature and pretty girls. My question is it possible to think of poetry as also a genre to be taken seriously when it comes to climate crisis and not just the apocalyptic model? I think so. There are reading practices which we can call Anthropocene reading, because this is the age of the Anthropocene, is a reading practice informed by a heightened consciousness of climate shifts and the environmental crisis. It can be retrospectively attached to, say, the English romantics, as people have done. But for most of our purposes, the Anthropocene reading practice has to do with a certain eco-pedagogy. And that is the training to read for not just the beauties of nature or the assaults on nature, but on the link between environmental injustice and social injustice. So it's no longer possible, especially for poetry from the global south, to think in terms of just, oh, let's look at nature and praise it, or let's look at the disaster in nature and praise it, simply because, as I would like to define it, a post-colonial eco-poetics is marked by concerns with the very local and the large planetary, with the history and the contemporary, with racism and spirituality, cosmology and capitalism. So I do not see a post-colonial eco-poetics or poetry and the reading practice from the global south as emphasizing only the micro-level problems of climate change. I think of the local as something that is the global writ at a local level. Let me give you an example of this in a minute. So I am arguing a case for a planetary ecological consciousness which cuts across the human and the non-human, the living and the non-living. It is interested in the making, unmaking and remaking of worlds, all three, which is aware of, the poetics which is aware of history, such as the plantations, slavery, dispossession, colonialism, and globalization, all of which have fashioned the planet in unjust, unequal ways, to which the poets bear witness. There is, of course, the romanticized and sentimental representations of the land, and the hero of that story would be Wordsworth, which include the fauna and flora of a particular place, the mythic and spiritual aspects of ancestral lands, etc., etc. Most of them employ these representations, especially when addressing the environment, and consequently represent it through what Amanda Johnson calls an aesthetics of despoliation, the aesthetics of spoiling, because there's a concerted effort at spoiling the world. One can discern such an aesthetic in Joy Harjo, Native American, Linda Hogan, Native American, Craig Santos Perez, Guamese, and numerous others, where sentiment and romanticization also serve the political aesthetics of despoliation, pointing to causal factors such as colonialism, slavery, or contemporary extractivist postcoloniality. I will take a slight detour here to explain what I meant by speaking about the planetary in the local. Most of us would like to believe that there are pockets on the planet which will remain unaffected by climate change. That's a myth. There is no part of the world which has not been already affected in some way or the other by climate change. The interior Amazon, the vast reaches of the Pacific, any place you go. Which means to say that no place on earth is actually safe. I will give you an example from a book which studies the Arctic Circle. Marla Cohn's book, Silent Snow. Marla Cohn noted that the quantum of toxic materials in the bodies of Inuit, Greenlanders, and Siberian people, they were industrial toxins. Now the odd thing is, there are no industries in Siberia or Greenland. So where did the chemicals come from? Now we inhale microplastics on a daily basis. We consume it, whether you are eating chips or just walking around. But Siberia, Greenland, the Arctic poles, where are the industries? So the mystery was, where did the toxic material come from? Where did they originate? So she dug through, did a lot of tests, tied up with local medical and health laboratories to find out. And it was interesting what she found. The chemicals in the bodies of the Greenland people came from industries in Pittsburgh, America, 8,000 miles away. separated by the Atlantic Ocean and the Bering Straits. So the second part to the mystery was, how did it go from Pittsburgh all the way there? More research. It's not like literature people who sit in a corner and read a book. This means actually going out into the field, by the way. That's why the lazy people do literature, We like our air-conditioned setting, nice book, feet up on this, kurkure on the side, Coke here on this side, TikTok on your phone, This kind of research requires a lot more hard work, That's why we don't do it. The answer was startling. The toxic materials moved up the Atlantic Ocean and entered into the bodies of the beluga whale and the seals. The Greenland Islanders and the Siberians eat whale meat and seal meat because those are the only two meats that can keep them alive in the sub-zero temperatures of the Arctic Circle. That's how the system, the bodies, the corporeal material ingested this toxic material. Marla calls it the Arctic paradox because they have the highest industrial toxins in their bodies in a region which is entirely devoid of industry. Think of the paradox there. So the question was, do you tell them to stop eating whale meat? If so, they will die. They cannot survive minus 60 degrees temperatures. Do you tell them what's wrong with the meat? So you move here from biochemistry and medicine to culture. That's the page and the planet. That when you tell them these chemical substances are toxic, so don't eat these meats, what you are effectively telling them is to stop their practices which they have had for the last several millennia, for multiple generations. So, do you think you are safe just because you are in the Arctic Circle? No. You will imbibe the materials. The toxins will be a part of you. And it's frightening to think that you can be living at the outermost reaches of civilization and get none of the goodies but all the bad things from 8,000 miles away just because water and air will carry that material. You can't stop it. It's a bit like COVID-19, How? The only thing you can do to prevent the virus from entering your system is by stopping breathing. You understand that, right? So the irony of the disease is that the one thing that keeps you alive, breathing, is what will kill you. What kind of option is that? Think of the irony of COVID-19. So it's toxins from the air. What keeps you alive is what is the most dangerous. So of course you can survive COVID. Just stop breathing. Exactly. You can try it. No, I don't advise you to try it. Otherwise you'll complain to the principal that this guy is giving all sorts of wrong medical advice. So let's now take a look at some examples of how this mixture, as I've pointed out, of environmental and social injustice merge in the poetry. I'll first look at Tanure Ojaide, a Nigerian poet, who describes how in post-independent Nigeria, the land has been mined and exploited, colonized and ruined. You have to scrub the land with bare hands. That's the quote, scrubbed with bare hands. Craig Santos Perez from Guam, in his series of poems, maps the American military and colonial naming, boundary marking, building that marked and deformed Guam. In Linda Hogan, profound melancholia haunts much of our representations of indigenous lands that are now dispossessed and desacralized. John Kinsella, writing in the postcolonial era from Australia, is conscious of the fact that the lands in Australia he writes about belong to the indigenous people. He's one of the line of poets who are alert to histories of conquest and human expansionism. This alertness resists a simple romanticization of the land. I am not at any point disputing that romanticization and sentimentalization have their uses. So please don't complain to Divya and Brinda saying you don't want to read Wordsworth anymore because they're too sentimental. They have their uses. Otherwise, what will happen to most of our South Indian cinema? If you stop sentiment and melodrama, the cinema will collapse. But there is something else you need to be alert to as well, which is my point. So this awareness and alertness resists a simple romanticization of the land as well as localisms, because the poets see and represent how the locale and the locality have been transformed due to the rhizomatic connections across the distant places, because they became parts of a neo-colonial empire. The local, therefore, then, is one page in the book of the planet. It's only one page in the book of the planet. And that page is not something you wrote. That page was co-authored by several people about whom you know nothing. Like the people in the Arctic Circle who are ingesting toxins from God knows where. No, perhaps even God doesn't know where. It comes from all sorts of places. So the page from the book of the planet is not always what you wrote. It is sometimes not even what you read. It's like children. You know how children read comic books? So sometimes a page is consumed. In literal ways, sometimes you consume a book. So the page from the book of the planet is sometimes what you ingest, and then it gives you problems. In most cases, postcolonial eco-poetics, when inscribing this little page, ascribes historical and contemporary causes, colonialism to the postcolonial, to the changes in their local pages, in their little chapters. And the poets invariably point to twin injustices, environmental and social. And the poets document catastrophes such as flooding, the loss of homes, and the failure of the state. Poets like Evan Boland, Irish, also point to such linkages. Ben Okri, African British, describes Tanzania, I quote, "The wastes of Tanzania where they mine the earth." The wastes of Tanzania where they mine the earth. The mining, and that's where the tragedy lies, as we know in all parts of India. The mines are very often located in the ancestral places of the Adivasis and the tribals. They are owned, within quotes, by the government, which sells the mining rights to the foreign mining company, petroleum, and that's the target of Ben Okri's poetry. In other cases, the poets speak about how local inhabitants who have no idea about the world are victims of a modernity and the high costs that they pay along with the land. And here is a set of lines from John Kinsella's massive 520-page poem Divine Comedy, which is of course a reflection upon Dante. Here is John Kinsella, quote, "The last blocks of bushland cleared away to placate the hunger for the Australian dream." I'll quote again. "The last blocks of bushland cleared away to placate the hunger for the Australian dream." And Kinsella notes the fact that the birds can no longer find food. There is no nesting place available. But what you can find are large earth-moving equipment, mining operations, and profit. None of those apply or appeal to either the indigenous people or the fauna and flora of that particular place, which is the point I am emphasizing. Trees are cut, the scrub cleared, so that the animals and birds that depend on these for their shelter and food are now left desolate. Over and above such accounts of violent alterations to the land that bring to the fore the exploitative and unequal social practices stretching from the colonial era to the post-colonial present, the mapping of the twin injustices, environmental and social, requires the poets to pay attention to not only the very local deprivation inflicted upon the plants and animals, but to the shifting human-non-human relationships. In other words, I am drawing your attention to the fact that none of these poets speak about just human suffering. Humans are smarter about suffering because we can talk about it. We build entire soap operas around it. We write our memoirs, and there's always a competing victimhood. I don't know if you have met that term before, so give me a minute to explain that. All of us know at least somebody to whom if you say you're feeling ill, they will tell you 3 illnesses that they have had. Oh, you have a headache? Oh, I have 3 different kinds of headache. Whatever misery you are presenting, they have more misery. It's called competing victimhood. I am victim. No, I am a bigger and greater victim. So there is no chance you will win because they are more powerful in enunciating victimage, which is how humans thrive too. Because have you thought about the irony that when we speak about animal rights, you have never met an animal demanding rights, have you? Have you seen dharnas by animals holding up cards saying we want justice? No, we do that on their behalf. Like children. Children's rights are not demanded by children. Children's writing is not by children. My wife is a children's book author. So I always tell her, no, but children don't write. No, you are writing on behalf of children. No, usually at that point the conversation goes elsewhere, as you can imagine. But the point is that when we speak about animal rights or planetary rights, you don't see the creatures doing this. The post-colonial eco-poetic tradition is very conscious of the fact that there is a shifting dynamics of the human and the non-human. And there are no clear ways in which you can document that in a very just fashion, simply because we have the language and they don't. Or at least, to paraphrase Jane Goodall, the primatologist, after 50,000 years, man still doesn't speak ape. We still don't speak ape language. They do have language which we may not understand, but we are the ones with the law, the environmental ideas, and of course, our multiple pages. So, poets do worry about it. So here we see Joy Harjo in her title poem in a volume called A Map to the Next World, saying, "We no longer know the names of the birds here, how to speak to them by their personal names." You do know that in most native traditions across the world, the tribal indigenous peoples, you think of even the rocks as being alive. It's called animism, the traditional system. You think of the rocks as alive. There are names. They are converted into gods and deities, and you speak of them as though you're speaking of persons, like you speak of animals as persons. So that's called animism. And animism is a well-established tradition of mysticism and spirituality in the world. Humans, as the eco-poetics from the Global South notes, have the arrogance in taking upon themselves to determine the course of nature, and our ability or our arrogance in naming creatures. Here is Linda Hogan's response to this arrogance of the human. She's speaking about, in a poem called Naming the Animals, a forest where animals do not need humanity. I quote, "All things know the names for themselves, and no man speaks them or takes away their tongue." All things know the names they know their names. They don't need us to speak with their names to their names. Changes in ownership, organization, and processes, from naming to boundary making to mining, alter interspecies relationships as demographics of predator-prey, keystone species, or pollinators change. And here is Craig Santos Perez writing about Guam. Quote, "Without birds, thousands of butterflies emerge from cocoons." Without birds. You do know when the top predator species disappear, others will flourish. So you cannot take away any one species and expect the ecosystem to be balanced. 2 weeks ago, there was a piece in one of the newspapers about how vultures are disappearing. The vulture population is going down. Vultures are absolutely integral to the ecosystem. They are not our favorite birds. I understand that. And so is the earthworm. Without the earthworm, the soil gets permanently damaged. And many of these authors also point to the fact that there's an aesthetic dimension to conservation. Let's take a simple example. How many of you know a vulture fans association? You won't. You won't find them. But everybody is keen on protecting the panda or the koala bear. They are cute and cuddly. Okay, you don't want to cuddle a polar bear. It's as large as a house. It's a little dangerous. There's an aesthetic appeal to the animals, and conservation campaigns run around that aesthetic appeal. Have you ever met a campaign to save frogs? No, come on, frogs? I mean, who's a fan of frogs? How many people find frogs appealing? We accept that there's some purpose to having a frog there, but the frog or the lizard, no. So things that we want to conserve and protect also have to have a certain aesthetic appeal, like teddy bears. They should look nice, they should be warm and cuddly, they should be beautiful. But frogs? I mean, unless you have a serious aesthetic problem, very few people will find frogs, earthworms, and vultures appealing. Snakes, for that matter. So there's a very strong aesthetic element to ecological debates as well, because as many of these people argue, without birds, thousands of butterflies emerge from cocoons. Oh, so butterflies are good, right? They're nice things to see. Yes, but an abundance of butterflies can be damaging. So we don't think about that chain. Whatever we've now got as permafrost on the Earth's polar surfaces is melting, as you know. What held them in place, what held the permafrost in place, is the megafauna, the mammoths. Because as they walked, they churned the soil. This is sounding like a chemistry lesson, isn't it? I'll try to keep it minimal. The megafauna have their uses in what effects they have on the land. The minute you take away the apex predators, the large fauna, the rest of the animal species will thrive, plant species will thrive, which will upset the balance in nature. Nature has its own ways of doing things. As you will see in Gail Tremblay's poem, Dimensions. She says, even the maggots are part of the sacred circle, devouring the rot, cleaning the earth. Even the maggots can teach us to survive. That's the point I'm trying to make. Even the maggots are part of the sacred circle, devouring the rot, cleaning the earth. Even the maggots can teach us to survive. This is nostalgia. There is a term for it, environmental nostalgia, or sometimes called evolutionary nostalgia, which has both nostalgia and melancholy. And these are key effects in the poetry of environmentalism from the global south. This double movement, nostalgia and melancholia, we can see in Inupiaq poet Joan Naviuk Kane in her poem A Few Lines for Jordan Tutu. If only we learned the old ways, we would learn where we fit in life. In singing Everything, Joy Harjo is nostalgic about the time when her people had songs for everything. Although post-colonial eco-poetics in the poetry of the global south is rooted in the local, it generates an Anthropocene solidarity across nations, across cultures, and across histories. In that sense, the poetry and any reading of a page of it is a reading for the planet. I'm inflecting the word for. The tone, approach, and modalities of reading for the planet, set by people like Jonathan Bate and others, demands that the pages are extracted beyond and outside the context in which they are immediately and usually read, in order to make them speak with an outside and beyond the immediate. In other words, the pages must be made to speak for the planet. They don't automatically do that because we are keener on looking at them as local instantiations of a problem or a local expression of a particular condition, which most emphatically is a reductive way of doing it. Reading for the planet or reading a page for the planet is not disembodied global cosmopolitan or universalist reading from nowhere. It's not a bird's eye view. Please don't think of it that way. But it's a reading from near to there, between specific sites, across multiple divides, at more than one scale. This is what I like to think of as multi-scalar reading, which shuttles between the microscopically specific and the world historical. And that's my big thesis here, such as it is. The multi-scalar reading practice, to repeat myself, the multi-scalar reading practice shuttles between the microscopically specific and the world historical in 4 dimensions across space and time, reading as a dynamic process of rescaling. Eco-poetics then is a feature of the poetry and a frame of reading, which is my second thesis, that when you read a page, the page is of course has a certain ecological dimension, but it also should be read within a particular frame, and that frame is neither local nor global, but both. So, which is why I'm referring to it as multi-scalar. Reading post-colonial pages, and my example is only poetry, is an instance of Anthropocene reading, as I've mentioned before, with due attention to flows, trajectories, and systems that go beyond national borders and human time scales. And I'll spend a minute on this. I've already mentioned planetary memory. There is something called Paleolithic or paleontological fiction, which is fiction set in the age of the dinosaurs before humans and the early humans, which is an attempt to ask ourselves, what is the pre-human history of the earth? And it has its exact opposite. Imagine a planet without humans, which is the subject of a Pulitzer Prize book by Alan Weisman called The World Without Us. What happens if we are not there? Okay, to begin with, you won't have conferences like this. There won't be pages. That's of course there. But can you imagine a world without us? Because we like to think, as in humans like to think, that imagination is our job. Do animals imagine? We don't know. They're certainly not writing poetry like Wordsworth. You know, have you ever seen a daffodils poem titled William Wordsworth? No. Wordsworth will write daffodils, but daffodils don't write Wordsworth, which is perhaps not a very good thing. I mean, it would have been better if daffodils wrote the poems. Never mind. So can you imagine a world prior to humans? And if you look at the novels by somebody called Stephen Baxter, called Evolution and Behemoth, it is an attempt to do that. So imagine the Cretaceous period, that is just after the comet hit the Earth and the dinosaurs were wiped out. Likewise, 50 million years into the future. So the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, as we know. The arrival of humans is a little blip in that period. We are very new. The earliest man is 1.5 billion years. So we are a speck in the cosmogony that marks the planet. So we don't really know or have a means of knowing planetary memory, except through the imagination, which brings us back to the point I began with, the ability to imagine another world. How does one imagine a world before humans or after humans? How do we do justice to places that are inexorably connected to the planet as a whole and to the perception that this wholeness encompasses vast heterogeneities, asks Ursula Hayes. And that's where the connections have to be made, about which we may or may not know anything. We see particular instances of this planetary turn of the page when postcolonial poets move across scales of space and time, bringing together histories, spatialities, and lives. The poets I have spoken about today rely on intergenerational memory and on planetary memory. It relies on antiquity and ancestry at a time beyond the present, even as a line of spirits, ghosts, and revenants come to metonymically stand in for this beyond time. The repeated return to ancestry and older connections within the land is a way of thinking about what has been called geological subjectivity, that we are in the world of geological subjectivity. We are made from that. And it's not only to do with the prayer, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. There's a very literal way of thinking about it. Note the fact that we walk because we have bones. We have bones because we have calcium. Calcium comes from the earth, and those are the remnants of fossils from 65 million years ago. Our bodies keep their functions going not only because of the bacteria in your stomach. There are 10 raised to power 14 bacteria in the stomach. I shouldn't say this before lunch, I understand. But you get the point. That's why people have to take probiotics when their stomachs are off, right? But it's also to do with the fact that the chemicals and the enzymes that keep us going are little bits and pieces of chemicals. Have you thought about the irony that what keeps us alive is the non-living chemical? All animation rests on the inanimate. All life depends on the non-living. Those chemical substances which make up our bones, the serotonin in your brains which make you depressed or happy, or all the other chemicals that keep your mental processes going or your physical processes going, are inert, are chemicals. It is in their interactions that we are alive. In short, all life depends on the non-living. We don't think about it that way. Humans like to believe that we are autonomous, coherent creatures, self-contained. We are not. We are kept alive by the tiniest organisms in the world, bacteria. And we are kept alive by what has never been treated as living, which is why people start talking now, Catherine Yusuf and others speak about geological life. It comes from the earth. And I mentioned oil and coal before, that we have what is called fossil fuel because of a biodegradation process from 450 million years before, well before mankind appeared on the scene. A process that took 450 million years to complete and give us fuels, we have gobbled up in a few centuries. Think about that. It required a few centuries for us to destroy the Earth's resources. Which means to say, this shift which I am trying to emphasize between the local and the global has a certain politics. That's a different argument and it's a different venue. But when we say a page and the planet, it's a page from the planet. A page composed by the planet which is decomposed. The process of organic breakdown, right? So all composition is actually connected to the acts of decomposition. There's no composition without that, you know? And the irony, or if you want to think of it that way, as the tragedy of that the post-colonial poets are trying to map is this constant movement between what is pre-human, fossil fuels, diamonds in the earth, animals, are part of our world. We have segregated those. That's non-human. That's pre-human. But there is no such thing as the human which doesn't draw upon or depend upon the pre-human. And whatever was part of the planet well before humanity appeared on the scene is what sustains us. We also recognize, as do several other poets, that it's difficult to think of a scale like that. I mean, to imagine 450 million years ago is what Tim Morton and others refer to as hyper-objects. It's beyond human abilities to comprehend a time scale like that. Literature can, others can't. To think of a world 450 million years ago. I'll conclude with a line not from poetry, oddly enough, but from Charlotte McConaghy's novel, Migrations. It's a novel I think several of you should be reading, especially those in your MAs interested in ecological criticism. Charlotte McConaghy, Migrations. The novel is about a woman who is interested in a tiny bird called the Arctic tern, T-E-R-N. The Arctic tern is interesting for what it does. Every year it flies from the North Pole to the South Pole and then back. It's a tiny bird. Flies all the way from the North Pole to the South Pole. It does this journey several times in its lifetime. And it's the equivalent of a human going to the moon and back thrice. That's the distance this bird covers. The problem is now when these birds make this migration, they don't get enough fish to eat across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans because the waters are so polluted. So many of the terns don't make it to the South Pole. They die en route. But their species memory is so strong that despite the fact that many of them are doomed, they will still fly. Mahmoud Darwish, the Lebanese poet, was the one who asked, where will the birds fly after the last sky? Where will the birds fly after the last sky? Because we have no longer left any skies for them. But the terns make that migration. So this character geotags some of them and is following their route all the way down to the Antarctic. She doesn't see the terns. So she makes this enormous and in several places illegal voyage on a bad ship and arrives at the Antarctic Circle where they should have reached by now. The terns should have reached by now. She doesn't see them. So what do you do? So she decides to kill herself in the waters of the Antarctic. And the novel begins with a question which she answers at the end. She asks, all these are disappearing, right? We know species loss, the IUCN Red List. And the character asks, what will happen to the world if the animals disappear? We will be left all alone, she says. We'll be left all alone. What will happen if the animals disappear? We'll be left all alone. So she makes this trip and she can't see the terns and she decides to kill herself. At that point, she turns a corner on the ice shelf of the Antarctic and discovers that the place is covered with terns. Several of them have survived the flight. And she says at that point, nothing will ever be as brave again like those birds. They travel 16 to 20,000 miles every year, back and forth, back and forth. Nothing will ever be as brave again. So she's about to wade into the ocean to kill herself. And she stops and she says, we are not done yet. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Your insights and expertise on the topic was truly influential and made a significant impact on us. Certainly, sir, you have marked an indelible mark in the pages of Department of English SF, which we will cherish forever. Thank you so much for making this day iconic, sir.
Dive deeper, discover more. Question and answer session is your opportunity to ask questions, seek clarification, and gain new perspective. We now welcome our audience to interact with our chief guest.
Don't ask me to explain that all over again, okay? This is not a class. Yep, go on.
Hello, sir. Excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
I'm glad to be here, sir, and listen to what you spoke. Could you please expand upon your displeasure of Wordsworth? Because I'm fascinated. On your displeasure of Wordsworth, because I'm fascinated by it.
Oh, okay. Tomorrow, if there are complaints to the English department, is because of this boy's question, okay?
That's okay, sir.
Well, think of one of his most famous poems. 1,000 saw I, right? 10,000 heads waving their heads. A host of daffodils. Etymologically, the word host means two things: guest and enemy. That's my first point. So when you say a host of daffodils, is Wordsworth referring to guests or enemies? Wordsworth doesn't clarify. And Wordsworth was not a stupid person. He was very well read. So he knew the Latinate root of host being hostis, which is both guest and enemy. Suppose you were to say that he is referring to 10,000 enemies. Okay, that's my first point. Second, there are all the heads waving in the breeze, right? That's a big image in Wordsworth. But they seem to be heads without bodies. Have you realized that? He speaks about heads moving. Would you like to encounter 10,000 heads without bodies attached? What's the effect? It's like something out of a bad nightmare, third grade Hollywood horror film. Detached heads floating around. And note how the description goes. He turns a corner and there are 10,000 heads floating. It's under no circumstances you can imagine a pleasant sight to have detached heads floating around like that. And then the word host. So that's my second point. Wordsworth is a specialist at not the pleasure of nature, but the pleasure of nature recalled. He is at his best in his cottage, lying on the sofa, recalling. Remember the other one? The music in my heart I bore, long after it was heard no more. All of Wordsworth is running away from nature because it's a little too much. And then he will recall it and write poems about it. So he goes to Tintern Abbey and he's not looking at the abbey. If you look at the poem carefully, he's looking at a tendril of smoke in the distance, which signifies human life. Actually, those woods had beggars living there historically. So it's a bit odd. No? When you go to the Taj Mahal, you are not looking at the Taj Mahal but at the attractive tourist guide. So there is a Taj Mahal and you are looking at, oh, good looking. What about the Taj Mahal? Taj Mahal is there, na? What can you do with the Taj Mahal? So Wordsworth is in the middle of the Tintern Abbey and is not looking at the abbey. He's recalling his previous visit. Wordsworth is a poet of memory. Specifically the memory of nature, not nature itself. So if you look at daffodils, he's happy when he has gone away from nature and is recalling. And it's very easy then to do that, right? Emotions recollected in... Yeah, it's not emotions there, it's emotions recollected, which we miss when we read that famous preface to the lyrical ballads. Okay, what he's saying there is, good, all scenes there. Now I'll quickly go home, have warm tea and write about how beautiful nature was. Wordsworth is and there's a lot of rocks in Wordsworth actually. There's a lot of geology in Wordsworth. And rocks are not pretty things. I mean, unless you are a big fan of rocks, you don't find aesthetic appeal in rocks. But for Wordsworth, he had a particular skill in transforming everything he saw into memory. So Daffodils is actually a poem about being upset at what he sees. So he quickly runs away and he says, oh, wonderful daffodils. Then why were you not there? Well, I saw 10,000 heads floating around like that. You may want to, the kids whose internet works here, want to look at a BBC advertisement on faces. They had to pull off that advertisement because of the upsetting effect it had on people. It's a large face. It's a multimedia installation. And then bits of the face fly off. Each is a face. So it was a bunch of faces put together. And then the faces disperse. People were very upset about it. And they said, we don't want that. So they actually had to pull off that ad. Imagine 10,000 saw I. He doesn't say I saw 10,000. 10,000 saw I. And the I is both I and the I. There's a play going on there. And what happens is Wordsworth turns a corner and he looks at 10,000 people staring at you. Ask yourself whether you'd be happy in that situation. No. And the word host. Daffodils is a poem about worry, about anxiety. It's not about nature. Another example. The Solitary Reaper, another very well-known poem, for reasons I don't quite understand. It's actually a poem. I know there are women students here and surely they will understand. It's about basically a man standing and staring at a woman. She's bent over and he's standing and watching. In today's day and age, it would be called a poem about a lecher. Why is he so interested in young women? Wordsworth's poetry is full of young women. Vanderkor and Julia, the Solitary Reaper, the lovely Highland Lass. All of them are about a middle-aged man standing and staring at a woman. Assuming that this is all very platonic and all that, okay, whatever. But it still cannot take away the fact that there is this guy standing and, oh, girl, No, but I want to write poetry, that's why I'm staring at her, okay. So that becomes a kind of justification. Solitary Reaper is full of those. If you read the poem very carefully, it's not a pleasant poem. And then quickly he goes back home and asks, will no one tell me what she sings? She is singing in the local dialect. He will not know what she sings. Will no one tell me what she sings? The music in my heart I bore long after it was heard no more. He's recalling. The poetry of recall. My final example will come from the Old Cumberland Beggar. Not perhaps his best known work. It's a longish narrative poem about a 70-year-old beggar who is wandering through the streets of that little village begging. And the speaker of the poem remembers this beggar from when he was a child. 70 years and 10, he says. I have seen this man. And he's a very old man. He's now got tremors. And Wordsworth's speaker describes this man trying to eat. He's got some scraps of food. But his hands shake so much that the food falls from his hand and the birds come and eat. And the old man, like all old people, walks with very short steps, looking at the ground, carefully walking. Wordsworth describes all this, which is fine. Up to this point, it's fine. Towards the end, he says something, and this is a direct reference to the poor houses of England, where the older people, the beggars, were placed so that they would be given food and clothing, and things like that, and warmth. And Wordsworth says, don't put him in that poor house. Don't put him in that poor house. He is a record of the village's charity. The people have given him food over the several decades and they have kept him alive. So he's a record. And he says, even though they don't have enough food, they share some food with him. So he glorifies the fact that the villagers are generous and give him food. So he says, don't take him away, because if they take him away, who will they give food to? And some of you may recall William Blake's The Human Abstract and the Divine Image. Mercy has a human heart, pity a human face. We would not be able to show generosity if we didn't keep somebody poor. That's Blake. So if you have to show generosity, you need poor people. You have to keep them poor. That's why T.S. Eliot would say Blake's poetry has the unpleasantness of great poetry. It's unpleasant. It tells you things you don't want to know. Blake says that. And here is Wordsworth saying, so he's a record. So look at the villagers. They have kept him alive for so many decades. Why should you lock him up? And then he says towards the end, here in the lap of nature he has lived. Here in the lap of nature let him die. That's the way the poem ends. Here in the lap of nature he has lived. Here in the lap of nature let him die. It's a very interesting thing to say that, all that, which is fine, I mean, when you read it in that fashion. But I have a very odd feeling about that poem and a very odd interpretation of it. Ask yourself this. This man is 70 plus and he still has to beg for a living. Think of your grandparents. Do you want them to beg? He lives in Cumberland. Temperatures go down to -3 in winter. As in the lap of nature he has lived, so in the lap of nature let him die. Do you want your grandparents exposed to that kind of weather? And Wordsworth is making this a prayer. He has lived like that for so long. What he's not asking is, why is it that after 70 years this man is still only a beggar? If you think in terms of even basic social welfare measures or social justice, there has been no progress in that man's life. He has remained a beggar for 70 years. And second, he's saying he has lived in the lap of nature, let him die there. To me, that's cruel. A 70-year-old man begging for a living, he can't eat because his hands tremble, and you are seeing him as an icon of nature and an icon of the goodwill of the people. But what you are not also saying is that society has kept him poor because it makes them feel good to give him charity. It's an extraordinarily evil poem. I've said that in print. It's not my interpretation here. I've said this in writing, which is why, because of the way he walks in several places, I have described Wordsworth as a pedestrian poet. The editor of the journal didn't like it. Wouldn't pedestrian mean sort? I said, no, I only meant he walks. He walks a lot. So they didn't like it. But he's a very pedestrian poet. And this to me is iconic, like Simon Lee, the Old Huntsman, and all those, about the cruelty in Wordsworth's poetry. That you are saying a 70-year-old man who will tremble in the weather, who will not have enough food, should continue to live like that because it makes you feel good. That's not acceptable. Now don't go back and read Wordsworth immediately, okay? Mm-hmm. Are we done? Okay, thank you.
Vash.
I will not be able to hear you unless you use the mic, please. Yeah.
So you gave us multiple perspectives on mining, so mining's effects on Earth. So what is your opinion about the capitalist approach to climate change?
The
sir?
what?
Capitalist approach to
The
climate
Capitalocene.
change.
One, the Capitalocene hinges on also a racial dimension, which is why we refer to it now as a racial Capitalocene. Capitalocene relies on the first world exploitation of the global south, and you cannot separate the two. So I do not think of the Capitalocene as exclusively the work of capital. It's racialized capital, where multinational corporations with active encouragement of the global south operate in these fields, which is a subject also of Ben Okri's work and all that Tanzania's mining and the uranium mining in various parts of India is a Capitalocene, yes, and that has marked a drastic rupture, shall we say, in the history of planetary memory. But it's driven by a racial impulse, which means the Capitalocene is an extension of colonialism. It has a new form. It's sometimes called Microsoft, it's sometimes something else, but the principles remain the same. So I would recommend that you think of the Capitalocene as a racial Capitalocene. That makes more sense. And there's an essay on it. If you Google, Francois Vergès has an essay on the racial. Is the Capitalocene racial or something? It's available free online. You might want to take a look at that. Thank you. Good question. Yeah.
So how do you think that we literarians can put our efforts to make this climate change a much more effective? How can we combat climate change much more effectively, sir?
You combat it by changing perceptions of the earth, of the planet. We don't necessarily have the signs at our disposal to stop anything. What you can do is change the language in which we speak about it, the languages through which we talk about human and non-human, and the fact that it offers us ways of imagining the world which the Capitalocene, for example, does not allow. So the job of the literary is to think of other ways of looking at the world, which has been dominated by one singular narrative, modernity or development. If you have been reading about the Wayanad disaster and the reports that have been ignored, you see that there's only one kind: development, tourism, money, etc., etc. But there were alternatives, which we didn't talk about. I do think, and yesterday when I was speaking to some of your classmates, Dinakaran and others, I was speaking about the fact that the classroom is still our primary battlefield. That's where it begins. That where we talk and how we talk and to whom we talk will make a difference. It takes time. It took 150 years for equal wages for men and women, didn't it? But it began with that. So it's a slow process. Also, you are battling extremely powerful forces. But you do find now ethical consumerism, ethical farming practices emerging. It takes time. This kind of change which has happened took several centuries. It cannot be reversed in 25 years. But you have to make a beginning somewhere. I do think the literary is the place where it begins. Excuse me.
So I have a question. I think most of the lecture of yours today was on butterfly effect. You had quoted that whole body is controlled by the non-living chemicals. The question I have for you is that, so does nature actually give space for free will to exist?
It's not a debate which I can talk about without moving into the theological. And the theological and the religious are areas I avoid like the plague. I don't get into that debate at all. But there is another way of thinking about the question of free will. If you were to think of nature and free will, would you think about it as equally distributed? The answer is no. Because creatures with even lower cognitive abilities do not have the same amount of free will as humans do. So as people will tell you, the jellyfish has survived for millennia without having a nervous system. It gives us hope to a lot of idiots among us. If the jellyfish can survive, so can we. But jokes apart, the point is also that what we consider free will is also the effect of millennia of evolution of our cognitive conceptual apparatuses. Does the bat have free will? Yes, as much as a bat can have free will. So the question has to be recalibrated. What are the degrees and differences of free will is a better way to think about it. So the animal has free will. In its definition, yes, it does. But it's overrun by other impetuses. The human free will dominates because our cognitive, mental, and emotional apparatus are far more evolved over millennia. So you cannot equate the free will of the animal, the free will of the plants, and the free will of human beings. So now, when it comes to plants, for example, in the field called critical plant studies, we think of plants as sedentary creatures. Actually, no, they grow up and they grow down. There is a kind of movement even among plants, but we don't think of it as free will, do we? We think of it as instinctual, this, that, and that. But the plant grows. The plant disperses its pollen. There is movement. But the problem is our definition of movement is human. It's not plant. Rocks evolve, change shape over millennia. We know that. Do you think of it as movement and free will? We don't. In the case of animals, to return to the point I was emphasizing at the beginning, there's a distinction between reaction and response. The animals usually have what is called reaction. Humans have response. Which would be your free will? So there is a gradation of free will that we have to account for, and there is the different kinds of free will that you can think about, which hinge upon the kind of evolutionary processes that have given us our kind of conceptual apparatus. 150 million years from now, the human conceptual apparatus, cognitive systems will not be the same. Like the hominids, first human beings, had brains weighing 75 grams. That's it. Ours is a much larger brain, which means the brain capacity has gone up. The neural networks are a few million in our heads. They're more primitive brains. So their free will would be limited to what they can muster up. So I think you should qualify what you're thinking about here, and it's a brilliant way of thinking about nature. So congratulations on that. But you think about it as differentiated and distinct. You cannot map the free will of a jellyfish alongside the free will of a human person. They are not the same. evolutionary paths have been different. And if you were to figure plants into the mix, then you have a bigger problem. For now, stay with the non-human person. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
So, I just have a question where I need your viewpoint on it. Like, it's a statement as well as a question on the book that we discussed here, The World Without Us. So, my statement is that a world without a Mother Earth or nature, without human being, what it will be. As generous as it sounds, aren't humans becoming very self-centered and selfish, that they think without humans nature cannot exist, or what might happen to nature? And if it is so, like if if nature can't exist without humans, why did God create humans on the 7th day of creation instead of the first? Because he created nature and the and the microorganisms and all those things first, for the first 6 days. And only on the 7th day human was created. So what is your viewpoint on it?
Yeah, that's a theological debate which I said I will not go into, because we have only humans who have told us that on the 7th day we were created. So the history of the planet has been written by humans. Nobody else is writing it. That's why we have that argument itself. So I will put that aside. I will not get into theological debates. I'm not competent. The other one, that's precisely the point that that book makes, The World Without Us. The world will go on. Your opening statement is the key. We are vain and arrogant to believe that the planet is because of us. And what happens when we are not there? Nothing happens if you are not there. There won't be literature classes. There won't be conferences and symposia and bridges and things like that. The world will continue. And new forms of life will thrive or not thrive. So, the world without us is an arrogant assumption that there will not be a world without us. No. The world will survive. Humanity may not survive. And the argument made by several pessimistic environmentalists is that perhaps humanity ought not to survive. Considering what we have done, better not survive. So the cockroach will survive. The cockroach, as we know, has survived for a longer period than humans. And it's a little insulting to think that the cockroach will survive and we won't. But it's also a very moral lesson that even the cockroach will survive and we won't. Good enough. So it's our undiluted arrogance to believe that the planet is because of us. And that's I like that word, vain. Yes, we are very vain because we are writing the history. We are writing the notations that define earthly schedules, planetary this and planetary that. Nobody else is doing it. And that gives us the arrogance that, what's the state of the planet without us? The planet will be just fine. We might miss Netflix, that's all. Well, the bats don't want Netflix, do they? So they'll survive. So the entire book is a thought experiment which says that the world will be just fine. Here's another part to that which I didn't talk about because it's not germane to what I was saying today, and that is what will be left of us in terms of how we contribute to planetary memory when we are no longer there. So if, for example, hypothesis, thought experiment, alien intelligence arrives on Earth and looks at what we have left behind, they might be puzzled, they might interpret it. Does anybody here read Calvin and Hobbes? People don't read comics anymore? Good God, there's no civilization without comics. Comics are the mainstay, not Wordsworth. I'm a big comics fan. Calvin and Hobbes, Calvin is a boy with a pet tiger, stuffed tiger. And they have imaginary conversations. And Calvin's point is very interesting, and I use it often to demonstrate our arrogance. Calvin says, the one proof of life, of intelligent life elsewhere in the universe is that they have never tried to contact us. That proves that they are very intelligent. They are very intelligent because they never try to get in touch with us. So we do not know what we will leave behind. So, but it's interesting to think in terms of what you said, vanity and being vain, as precisely what has created this crisis, because we think we own the world. We don't. We don't. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Hello, sir.
Hi.
Sir, can you please say just on significance and signifier in structuralism?
No, that's not the subject of the talk. We'll have a separate tutorial for that. Asking questions from literary theory now? No?
So, just a few words.
The signifier is the word, the meaning is the signified. So when you use the word cat, the cat is empty as a signifier. The signified is what we have brought to bear upon it. We have generated the meanings out of it. And that process is called signification. So the word cat makes sense because it's different from the word bat or hat. And all signifiers are made clear to us in their difference from something else. Done.
Thank you, sir.
Good morning, sir.
Hi.
I just have a question about your point view when you talked about nature and about pessimistic view of Wordsworth or Blake writing about a old man. You said, right, like the story about a 70-year-old still wanting to die in such a way. I just have a question. It's just out of curiosity, sir. Maybe it would be wrong, but isn't we humans are naturally attracted to looking at life pessimistically, whereas nature is teaching us it is normal way, and where Wordsworth or Blake has written it as an acceptance. They have accepted that. That's my point of view, sir. They have accepted the reality of sadness and they have seen it in a beautiful way. But why would you have to point it out again as a pessimistic way?
Well, there are two ways of answering your question. One is, literature is never one-sided. So there is always the Blake point of view which notes that there is evil, there is distress, there is suffering. Then you could also have the comic element. So there is one view of the world which says we are out to destroy ourselves, which is what others have been talking about, the world without us. But the other perspectives which say that all hope is not gone, which is why I concluded with the example from the novel Migrations. We are not done yet. So the problem for many critics is that we have taken climate change too casually, and the only way we can make people aware of it is by shocking them and by driving home into their concrete heads that things are not all right. Because for all practical purposes, you don't see climate change, but a disaster will show you. So the pessimistic strand within environmental thinking, and I'll keep the focus on that, is because for many people, we are not doing enough things fast enough. We are letting things go slowly. Let it take its time. But we don't have time. One example I will give you. I do not know whether you follow the COP debates, the IPCC reports. The debate now is between a 1.5 degrees rise in temperature and the 2-degree rise in temperature, which we can permit. The latest one in Dubai was also around this particular debate. 1.5 degree rise in temperature, they have said, is okay. 2-degree rise in temperature means the seas will rise and all the coastal cities, whether it's Madras or California, will be drowned. The seas will rise with 2-degree rise in temperature. The point made at the conference is the Pacific Islands will disappear completely. New Zealand will disappear. So one of the poets from that says, you think it's a matter of 0.5 degrees. No, it's a matter of millions of people, plants and animals. So for you, 1.5 and 2, there's not much. You'll use more air conditioning, that's it. But what she says is, but with 1.5, we have barely managed to survive, and the Pacific is now overflowing the borders in the Pacific Islands. 2 degrees means they are wiped out. Islands, by the way, have disappeared entirely under the sea. So she is asking in her poetry, you are talking numbers. 1.5, 2, what's the big difference? It is not big. It's catastrophic difference. So here pessimism is the only way to think about it. You are worrying about 0.5. No. You do not understand the ramifications of a 0.5 shift. So for most of those people whose livelihood depends on that 0.5 difference, there is no optimism possible. There's no optimism possible. So the emphasis on the negative or the frightening is because we are not doing enough things fast enough. That's why the pessimism, the gloom and doom is overwhelming, which is the point you are making too. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, sir. So I have a question which in my perspective I consider to be a complex relationship. So how do you see the intersection of human rights and cultural production in India, particularly in relation to marginal communities?
I will retain the perspective on the from the environmental point of view, if you don't mind. Yes. And one, cultural rights and cultural responsibilities go together. First move. Second move, we presume that the marginal communities have a far more empathetic relation with the environment, which is not always true. I spoke about the romanticization. This part of it. But in the process of taking away what is left of their environment, we have also denied them the right to be responsible. So the corporatization of the land, the air, and what's under the land has led to sub-marginalizations, because smaller and smaller communities are being affected. And we have made it categorical that they have neither social nor environmental rights, which is the point I've been running through my talk, that you cannot speak of environmental rights without speaking of social rights. So when you speak about cultural production, and I presume you also imply it as cultural rights.
Human rights and cultural production.
Yeah, so you cannot speak of one without the other. So if, for example, there, and that was my response to the previous question as well, 1.5 to 2. 1.5 is my right, 2 is death. You are telling me that 2 is okay. It's okay for you, it's not okay for me. So there's an unevenness to the debate, because the debate is controlled in very specific ways by people who profit from it. And the difference is also between, and that's my next point, between profit and survival. So when we speak of human rights, environmental justice, we are not talking rights in an abstract vacuum. We are speaking about it as a matter of survival, which is hugely different from profit making, isn't it? So, for example, there are accounts now of how many Aboriginal people in Australia have cancer from nuclear tests conducted in the 60s. In the 60s, mind you. And the fact that uranium, the tailings are what's left after uranium mining, have polluted the land so much. Now, the Aboriginals are not complaining yet, because they do not have the necessary literacy to talk about it. That's your cultural production. There is only one book I am aware of which is written by an Aboriginal on the nuclear problem. One. This Country Be My Country. That's the title of the book. She notes the fact that she has cancer, everybody else has cancer. Now, there is no cultural production because their literacy rates are not adequate enough. So we just assume they're all right with it. Did they object? No, come on. So you see the interlinkage here, which is far more dangerous, simply because we say, oh, there's no cultural production, there's no protest, there's no this, no that. So if you were to talk about human rights, you have to speak about the languages of human rights, which we are not doing. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Hello, sir. So my question is, recently human-animal conflicts has been on a steady rise, and the so-called political and capitalistic solution seem to be a mere panacea. So for example, we can take the Sundarban region, where the conflict between the tribal people and the people over there and the Royal Bengal tigers, and the tigers have become man-eaters over there. And the government and the forest departments are shooting the tigers, and we can't blame the tiger either, because it has become man-eater only due to loss of habitat. And we can't blame the people either over there. So this is the vulnerability going on there, and man right from the beginning, he tends to create problems solutions, and he goes to seek the bare minimum solutions or impractical solutions, and this has been going on in a cycle every time, especially with regard to nature. So what do you think as a literarian, and what is your viewpoint on this, sir?
There are no real solutions to the human-animal conflict, for the simple reason that once you take away their habitats, they will come into the city looking for food, for instance. And I read out the John Kinsella poem where it says there's no bushland left anymore. And where will the birds go? They do not have space to even nest. So they will come into the city and then they become a nuisance. So you use the example of a predator like the tiger, and you will, if you know your hungry tide, that's all, the human-animal conflict is there in the hungry tide. So one, the devastation of habitat, which, as you yourself just said, is what humans have done. The predators didn't do it. And now the problem is of the vulnerability of the human to the animal, which may have been induced because the animal has been rendered vulnerable for the past several years. Hence the effort at things like biodiversity, to create parks. In none of the zoos do you find creatures that have been bred in the wild. They have all been bred in captivity. Right? In the name of conservation, protection, or whatever. That's a different thing altogether. For many people, this is not a solvable problem. It is not a solvable problem because the large-scale devastation of habitats will force the animals into human territory. We have not acknowledged their rights, their habitats. We just assume that they will adapt. No, how will they adapt? It's not a question we are asking. So the human-animal conflict will continue until such time as we recognize that the planet is not ours alone. So it requires, like I said in response to somebody else's question, massive amount of time to change that attitude. Have you noticed the fact that you don't see sparrows anymore in cities? Or crows? There are no sparrows. You know? I will apologize in advance for this autobiographical note. It's immodest on my part, I understand, but it demonstrates partially what the problem is. My colleague and I take care of 14 dogs on our campus. They are called strays for some reason. They are in and around the humanities. So I've been agitating that we should call it the humanimalities, because the animal is part of the human anyway. We have our department dog, Ramesh. Some student named him Ramesh, I do not know why, but never mind. He comes to our classes, attends, sits in my office, attends all our meetings. So the dean objected. The dean said, if you throw him out, we will also leave. He said, you people, So my car boot is full of dog food, milk and biscuits and dog food and things like that. And there have been repeated complaints that it is because people like us are feeding the dogs that they create problems. All right. Our question to them, which I have not received an answer to, is if you don't feed them, then they'll become less aggressive, is it? I mean, what kind of stupid argument is that? So their argument is, no, but they are coming into the building, they are hanging around outside. Yes, they are. They bark. Dogs are dogs, no? It's not that humans are more sensible. This is the argument which we make, which annoys people. I should not make such arguments, but I said to the dean, I'm thinking of offering Ramesh a faculty position. He comes to class on time, without fail, doesn't miss a single class. Rain or shine, he is in class. The teacher isn't there. The students are in there, but Ramesh is in class. 11 to 1, my class, till 12:45 he'll be there. Then he'll get up and say, okay, done. Enough, you have bored the hell out of people. Ramesh is a very dutiful student, as are our dogs. Our colleagues are generally, they'll come in and say, oh, dog. And we don't make things easier because we have a box of biscuits. We feed the dog and sometimes we give the same biscuits to the guests. They are not dog biscuits, by the way. We give them Mari biscuits. And sometimes they say, oh, you have biscuits. I said, yes, the dog needs. Then they look at us like this. So you're giving us what you give the dogs. Well, yes. That kind of conflict also occurs, and I don't know whether you are aware of the animal rights. There's a government order on it that anybody harassed for feeding animals can be prosecuted. So you should not, if they are not taking your money to feed them. So when our registrar, in a fit of absence of mind, put out circulars about dangers of dogs. We sent him copies of this. This is a ministry order. So I told him, you better shut up or I'll bring the dogs to your office. He decided that he will handle the dogs, but he doesn't want to handle me, so he let it go. You cannot resolve it, honestly speaking. You cannot. Because, and now they are trying to subcategorize dogs which you cannot keep. I don't know if you have seen that circular which came out 2 months ago. Some dogs like the Rottweiler and the Pit Bull, you cannot keep as pets because they are believed to be more aggressive. So you cannot. That's also a kind of human-animal conflict because we categorize them. Acceptable dogs, not acceptable dogs. I don't have an answer to that, honestly. You do the best you can by treating them in a way that they understand. And all these years of, I take care of 6 strays in my street at home. And I get into trouble with my neighbors. So now I started feeding them at 4:30 in the morning. There are only 2 things alive and moving at that hour, the dogs and me. So I feed them before. I wake up early anyway. And in the humanities building, this is a huge controversy. So there are people from various departments who says, some professors are feeding the animals. So to some people, because I'm not a very polite person and I'm not trying to win popularity contest, I tell them, you should be very glad I am not feeding you to them. Which of course doesn't get me any popularity points, but popularity is Shah Rukh Khan's problem, not mine. So, yeah. So I don't think there are solutions. Sorry.